Listeners, the Al Ihlas Academia Library in Cape Town, South Africa, welcomes all live stream viewers and listeners. This webinar is part of a series of talks, discussions, and debates organized by the Academia Library as part of a campaign to educate and empower our communities during this current pandemic. We don't have a physical library presence, and we are using webinars to facilitate education and transfer knowledge. A reminder that on both Facebook and YouTube, or at least those on those channels, we invite you to post questions to the panel at any time. Today's topic is something that I'm personally passionate about, and I think is a topic that is more relevant today for all of humanity than in the past. We are here really to discuss the state of the earth, or at least to start discussing the state of the earth, the global sustainability challenge, and our responsibilities as communities. Over decades of human civilization, we've observed what we can call really unsustainable use of what the earth gives us, and unsustainable methods in the way that we treat things like waste. This has led to significant issues, of course, that ultimately impacts on all of our communities. Scientists have been keeping track, very interestingly, of something called the biocapacity of Earth. And it is essentially keeping track of how much natural wealth the Earth gives us in 1 year, be it fish from the ocean, fruits on trees, metals to make our appliances and vehicles. And the same scientists keep track of the day in every year when we consume more than what the Earth is able to provide, or that it can regenerate. So coincidentally, today, the 22nd of August, marks the day that the human population is taking more from the Earth than it is able to reproduce in 1 year. It is called Earth Overshoot Day. It is measured every year by scientists. So from tomorrow, we are essentially using next year's allowance. We are using the resources and the natural wealth of tomorrow's generation. So given this context, today's topic is really asking that question: are we responsible for this? And what can we do about it? Or what can we start doing about it? And this is, of course, not a new global issue. It's been around for centuries. So the objective of the discussion is really to make a start at raising awareness of this issue in our communities, or to improve awareness of the issue in our communities from both a scientific and a religious perspective. And hopefully we can start thinking about ways that this may apply to our daily lives. Before I introduce this evening's speakers, a special thank you to Rondebosch Medical Center for its sponsorship and support. Today's speakers are firstly Malcolm Gray. Malcolm Gray is the CFO of Librio, a fast-growing legal and environmental compliance technology company. Malcolm spent several years in the investment management industry looking at ethical, sustainable Sharia funds as part of his remit. He's also an admitted attorney, has been instrumental in many sustainability initiatives in South Africa, and is a senior associate at the University of Cambridge's Institute for Sustainability Leadership. We also have Dr. Gaathir Mahed, currently serving as the Deputy Dean for the Faculty of Science at the Nelson Mandela University. He has a PhD and a master's degree in hydrogeology. Amongst others, he's been awarded for the brightest young minds in South Africa and listed on the Mail and Guardian top 200 young South Africans. Mohamed West is a guest lecturer for the Al Kawthar Institute. He's an imam at the Burhanul Islam Masjid and holds several other positions, including the senior accountant for a large retail company. Mohamed holds a degree in Islamic theology from the University of Medina and has done his accounting science degree through UNISA and is a qualified chartered accountant. And lastly, but not least, Nabil Mohamed, based in Cairo, currently a student of Arabic and Islamic studies, has done extensive research in the field of sustainability and Islam. He holds an honors degree in Islamic studies, a BA in politics, philosophy and economics, and a BSc in mechanical engineering. So I'd like to open the discussion with Malcolm, who can perhaps tell us a bit more about the state of the earth and the sustainability problem.
Well, good evening, Nasir, fellow panelists, and our audience today. Very, very nice to be with all of you today. It is indeed a fairly seminal day today, with it being the Earth Overshoot Day. And Nasir, thank you very much for raising that. So I guess maybe just to start with, it's always good to kind of have context, and the context for us is really our home. And in 1967, 68, during the first lunar planning trips, we got to get a glimpse of what Earth looked like from space. And this is our home. It's a finite resource. We don't really have anywhere else at the moment to go, although we do have a South African like Elon Musk who's planning to get to Mars. But for now, we'll need to figure out how to survive where we are. Bringing it closer to home, the Western Cape is a phenomenal environment in which many of us live today. I myself am a resident of the Western Cape, and we're endowed with a great many resources. We have a wonderful environment in which we operate. We have access to the beaches, we have access to the mountains, and some lovely parts of the Western Cape. But at the same time, it is a piece of land that essentially lives on the edge of a significant desert, which is in the hinterland of the Western Cape and covers a significant portion of South Africa and Southern Africa. And it's always important to understand the fragility of the environment within which we actually operate. And as we really start to grapple with the sustainability problem, it's maybe worthwhile to just take a step back to try and at least use one lens with which to look at the sustainability challenge. So to go to a much more distant place, the island of Hawaii, and more specifically Mauna Loa, which is an observatory in Hawaii. And why do I raise this place? It is actually an observatory which is being used to track a number of scientific data points. And most importantly, in the context of the conversation we're having today, the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. Now, CO2 is the carbon dioxide emissions that we essentially, as humans, as we burn fossil fuels and a number of other activities, emit into the atmosphere, and has been responsible as one of the key gases for what is now often considered climate change or the greenhouse gas effect. And that data has been tracked for a number of years. The data started getting tracked in the late 1950s. And the graph here is showing the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere in parts per million. It is one observatory, but there are many of these sites around the world that track this data. And I thought it would just be interesting to kind of contextualize like where we're at. So I was born in 1971. The CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere back in 1971 were around 327 parts per million. As of the 17th of August this past year, the CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere are around about 412, a 28% increase in CO2 concentrations. And that line is essentially, unfortunately, not a linear line, but increasingly looking like an exponential growth line. And it very much tracks the growth of the human population. It very much tracks in line with our incredible economic output that we've achieved in the past 250 years. Now, scientists are able to go back much further, and they can have a look at what CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere used to look like. And this is going back with data over about 10,000 years. And what we can see here is the significant acceleration that's taken place in the last 250 years. And you can see that at no point in the last 10,000 years have CO2 concentrations been at such a high level. And if we look at data going back even further, there is no point in human measured history at the moment, not human measured history, but the planet's measured history, that we're able to see such high concentrations of CO2. And this is resulting in a number of significant changes. And I think bringing it closer to home, back to the Western Cape, what we're starting to experience is increased what we call climate volatility. And that climate volatility is being experienced by all of us in the Western Cape and in many parts of the world in various ways. I think a good example of that would be the droughts that we experienced in 2016 and 17, and how, irrespective of where you were in the economic and social spectrum, it affected all of us in one way or another. Another example of the kind of significant impact that we're starting to experience by the pressure that we're putting on our planet was actually noted on the 7th of January 2016. Now, I'm not sure where many of you were on that day, but if you were in the Western Cape, it was the hottest day on record, 45 degrees Celsius recorded in Cape Town that day. And this is a trend that has been noted across temperature anomalies, not only in South Africa, but around the world, as to how our extremes are getting more. Our hot days are getting hotter and our cold days are getting colder. But in aggregate, both on land and on sea, things are getting warmer. And you don't need to think back too far. You just need to go back a month or so to June this year, when we had the big storm of June this year. And this is Sea Point in Cape Town. Some people thought it was snow, but in actual fact, this was the storm surge. And what's starting to happen in many low-lying areas, and the Western Cape is prone to that, is that we're starting to see storm surges as a result of the increase in sea levels, starting to push further and further inland. As the storms get more severe, the impacts really touch on everybody's lives in one way or another. Of course, it's not just a climate issue that we need to think about. We've also been exposed to an economic system that is increasingly favoring the rich and prejudicing the poor. And in a world where climate change results in extreme changes, such as sea pushing in, greater rainfall and floods, warmer temperatures, it's the poorest of the poor that are starting to bear the brunt of what is actually starting to happen across the world, and something that we need to be increasingly mindful of. And so I think it's an important point to pause and to think about what actually sustainability means, what actually it means within the context of where we live today. And so I think no better example than the current crisis that we've been going through under COVID. We spoke about flattening the curve in the early days of COVID. And I think it's with due credit, not without challenges though, that our governments in South Africa and in many parts of the world were able to flatten the curve in a way that ensured that we didn't overrun the healthcare capacity. Why was it so important to flatten the curve? Well, it was important to flatten the curve because we have limited capacity within the health system. And if too many lives were at risk and we're not coming into the healthcare system, we might overwhelm the healthcare system. And we're faced with this very same crisis from a climate perspective today. And what we need to all individually start thinking about, and as communities, is how do we flatten the climate curve? We have limited capacity, and we need to ensure that we're able to reduce our impacts and get the climate and get many of the measures that we look at, whether it be availability of water or many of the other natural resources that we rely on, back within the parameters which our Earth can actually rationally provide. Nasia spoke about today being Overshoot Day, Global Earth Overshoot Day. We are currently living above the line, and we need to flatten the curve in order to get back to a sustainable environment. We live within a beautiful part of the country here in Cape Town in South Africa, but currently we're putting increasing pressure, which is visible across many of our communities, and importantly in many of the high density communities where the poorest of our fellow citizens live. And we need to think about that. Ultimately, we have one Earth, And it's important for us to understand how to live within the parameters and the limitations that we have already set in order to ensure that all of us can have a long and sustainable future. So hopefully that's given a decent introduction to the sustainability conversation for today. So Nasir, thank you, and back to you.
And Malcolm touched on a very important and very significant issue, which is the issue of climate change and how it essentially affects and has knock-on effects for everything that we do. And we saw very local, very severe examples quite close to home in Sea Point. Next up, we will have Gaathir Mahed to share some of his perspectives based on his research and his experience, who's also done significant work, not only looking at the climate change issue, but also looking at climate change in the context of Islam.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي امري واحلل لساني يفقهوا قولي. Assalamu alaikum, good evening to all the listeners and all the panel members. Thank you for having me this evening. I just want to thank Malcolm for setting the background, so beautifully, in a sense that now you're able to understand the context and the kind of issues we're dealing with globally. But from a perspective of hydrological sciences, in terms of just to accentuate what Malcolm was talking about, we see that the kind of issues we're facing, whereby, particularly in a South African context, you're finding that in certain places now, where there maybe wasn't enough rainfall, and a good example is Beaufort West, where in 2010 they had extensive flooding to the point that some of the water levels in the wells were raised by more than 20 meters. And now, a few years later, they've been unsustainably pumping that water, and the water levels have dropped. So you find that these shifting global patterns are having such a great impact, not just from a hydrological perspective, but to the point that people are now becoming what they call climate refugees. And you are finding their livelihoods are directly impacted. So yes, we're talking about issues around climate change and sustainability and changes in temperature, but this has a direct impact on us from a social perspective. And now in recent times, we also find that more and more companies and municipalities and people are employing scientists to understand these risks, because it has a very large impact on their bottom line. So they need to be able to predict these risks so they can protect assets, so they're able to look at solutions in terms of what is viable and what is not. And Malcolm also alluded to the fact that, and I think this is something that's particularly important, climate change is not a new thing. We look into the geological records and into certain rainfall precipitation records from the Ming Dynasty in China, from these geological offshore records in certain places from ice cores, and we see there was some minor fluctuations in the past. But the point is, and Malcolm raised it, is the anthropogenic climate change, whereby we've accelerated this to the point that we are now shifting global weather patterns, we are affecting biodiversity, and one could argue that Corona is a good example, whereby we're having a direct impact on diseases and the vectors for those diseases. And if we look, I'm going to jump ahead of Sheikh Mohamed, but if we look into the Quran, there are actually examples of where we can see climate change. And a good example, and one that, we've been doing research over the past few years, and we're actually busy with a book now on climate change and lessons from the Quran and Sunnah. There's a dream that the king had at the time of Nabi Yusuf. And he dreams of 7 fat cows and 7 thin cows. And if one looks at that in a modern context and how Nabi Yusuf interprets those dreams, the 7 fat cows are 7 good years, and the 7 thin cows are 7 bad years. And fundamentally, in a modern context, this is really El Nino and La Nina, whereby, your drought years and your good years are directly linked to one another. So these kind of phenomena are not new to us. It just becomes a case of us looking at them objectively, trying to understand how they're impacting us in our daily lives, attempting to mitigate them, obviously, with plausible solutions, and then implementing those solutions. But from the perspective of us, in the context we find ourselves in, the Western Cape in particular, and South Africa and Africa at large, there's so many unique possibilities from an indigenous knowledge perspective that we're able to utilize. And I think, that's a plausible solution for us to start looking into. So with that said, I really think that, this is a critical discussion for us in our community to have, so that we're able to open up people's eyes, because, we laugh about it and we say, in our community, generally, people are just lawyers, doctors, pharmacists, and accountants. Nothing else is really a viable career. But we need scientists that are looking at these issues. We need people to inform us. It's a critical part of our developing our knowledge base as a community. And I think with that said, I just want to thank the panelists and Nasir for introducing us. And, hopefully we'll get some interesting questions from the viewers at home.
Thank you. Thank you, Gaathir. And you touched on a very important point there that I actually want to come back to, which is on the role of our governments, because we can't put all of the responsibility on the communities, but we also need to think about the role of our governments and councils and what they do to help solve the problem. So, we've seen this is not a new problem, and throughout human history, including in the times of the prophets, peace be upon them, we face similar issues. So, Mohamed West, I'd like to bring you in here to perhaps give us some perspectives from stories of the prophets or times of the prophets, similar to the one that Gaathir has given us, to really show us and demonstrate at least that this issue of sustainability has been around and that possibly there are solutions.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. To all the viewers and to the panelists, I begin just with an apology. I'm suffering from bad allergies today. I know we're talking about, are we killing the planet? I feel like the planet is killing me today. So, but inshallah, this is a wonderful discussion. And from my perspective, as an imam speaking to a faith-based community, to a Muslim audience, we know that speaking about climate change and speaking about the environment is important, but we as a community have, been laxed and have not moved, been at the forefront of taking this discussion forward and being a model society in this regard. And it's something that we need to work on. And I want to talk, inshallah, about 5 points why it's important for us as a Muslim community, as a faith-based community, to take this issue seriously. It's not just important economically. It's not just important for the well-being of our lives here, but for us, more importantly, it is a spiritual issue. It impacts you as your iman, and accountability on the Day of Judgment. So, the first point is why we have been put here. If you look at the Quran, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says, "Huwaladhi ja'alakum khulafa," that He has placed mankind as in the position as a khalifa. A khalifa meaning His substitute, the one who will, the custodians of this earth. Allah Subhanahu wa Taala has said that He has placed us here as custodians on the earth, and He has given us وَرَفَعَ بَعْضُكُمْ فَوْقَ بَعْضِ دَرَجَاتٍ. He has given us degrees of blessings so that you may be tested in that. Allah, God Almighty wants to see from us that we uphold the law and the natural conditions of this planet. In another verse, Allah Subhanahu wa Taala says that that the sun and the moon, they move with precision, and that the stars and the trees, they prostrate in submission, and that the sky has been raised up, and He has set the criterion. He has made everything in a perfect balance. Allah tataghaw fil mizan. So do not transgress this balance. That our duty as custodians of this planet is to ensure that the natural harmony is maintained. And the second point is when the Almighty speaks about the rest of creation, He includes us as part of a community. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that there is no creature on the earth or bird that flies in the air except that it is a community like you. They communicate, they have feelings, that they are part of the environment that you live in. And in fact, on a side note here, it's always asked, and I get this question quite often, when did Islam begin? It did not begin with Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. It did not even begin with Adam alayhi salam. Islam began the moment the Almighty created a creation. And Islam means anything that is in submission to the natural law of the Creator. So the sun is a Muslim, the stars are Muslims, the grains of sand are Muslims. Everything in creation obeys the law of the Creator, and there's harmony. And when we transgress that law, when we go beyond what is the natural state that we're meant to be in, this is where things go wrong. So we are part of a community, and we should treat everything around us with sanctity. Allah says that His mercy and His love encompasses all of creation, and therefore to harm any creature, living or animate or inanimate, this is something that it transgresses against the Almighty. Number 3, very interestingly, that how we treat the environment is linked by the Prophet, peace be upon him, as a level of our iman. Now, as Muslims, the most sacred thing to us is our faith, and how we interact with the environment is a barometer of your iman. The Prophet, peace be upon him, says that iman, faith, can be divided into 70 parts. The lowest of it, the smallest level of faith, is to take something that is harmful from the road to remove it, to remove something that is harmful from the road. Now, conversely, to see something harmful on the road and you do nothing about it is a question. It puts a question mark around how strong is your iman, and how much worse is that then if you actively put harmful things in the environment, you pollute the environment, then really it is definitely sinful, and it brings into question our level of spirituality. On the other extreme, so that is the lowest form. The Prophet says that is the lowest form of faith, to remove something harmful from the road of others. The highest form of faith is something called ihsan. And ihsan is this state of awareness where everything, you recognize the sanctity of everything. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, says ihsan, this level of excellence, is that even when you were to slaughter an animal, if you are going to slaughter something, you do it with the utmost love and care, that nothing should suffer, that your interaction with all of creation should be one of mercy and with love. Point for number 4 is to say that this religion is very Islam is very, very strict when it comes to excess and going out of bounds, whether it is in worship, whether it is in your spending, whether it is how you consume things. Very clearly Allah says that eat of the fruits that has been given to you and pay the due charity that is upon you on the day of harvest, and do not be excessive. Do not go beyond the means, do not go beyond the bounds, because God does not like those who exceed the limits, who commit excess. And in another narration, the Prophet, peace be upon him, he saw one of his companions taking wudu, taking the ritual ablution before prayer. And the Prophet said to him, Ya Sa'ad, what is this waste? You're using too much water when you're performing your ablution. And Sa'ad says, is it wasteful that I'm using water for the sake of prayer? I mean, I want to wash myself properly so I'm going to stand before God Almighty. Is it really, I can understand extravagance in my daily dealings, but this is for God's sake. Is this really waste? And the Prophet said, yes, this is waste and it's bad. And the Prophet even went then further to say, this would be wasteful even if you had a river running in front of you, meaning using more than you need, even if there's excess, even if you have an unlimited supply, uncapped, it is still wasteful and it is still sinful to use more than you need. And so we are a people, and our religion is an ethos that you only use what is the bare essentials, and to not go beyond what is required. In fact, it is encouraged to abstain, to fast, to limit your usage of the blessings God has given you, and to use it in such a way that it is not depleted, and that it is never gone beyond what is excessive. And that spiritual enlightenment is to, for example, they will say, to reach the level of spiritual enlightenment, you eat less, you talk less, and you contemplate more. You're more in the state of dhikr. And so this is what our religion is about, being moderate in everything that you do and never to be excessive. Of course, the last point is that there are consequences and accountability. So we are meant to maintain this balance. We are meant to use things within limits. But if we go beyond those limits, there are consequences, and we're beginning to see those consequences. In a panel discussion about a few days ago, someone asked me, how can an all-merciful creator allow something like the coronavirus to happen? And the answer isn't really that he has imposed a virus upon us. It is a consequence of the way we live our life. It's a consequence of certain bad habits, and this is our own doing. And so he says corruption has appeared throughout the land and sea. One can call it pollution. The harm has appeared on land and sea by reason of what you people have done with your own hands and what you have earned. And then he says, and that you are tasting only a portion of what you have done, and hopefully that you will return, that there's always a chance to come back and to fix things. So if we do not live within these limits, there is a tipping point where there will be consequences. We know that whatever you do, and I want us as Muslims to consciously think that when I make a choice that is good for the environment, I'm being rewarded for it. It is good for my iman. It's good for my akhirah. It is a charity. The Prophet peace be upon him says that if you plant a tree and anything that benefits of its shade or eats from it, an animal, whatever it might be, it is an ongoing charity. That tree will outlive you. You would die. You can't make salah anymore after 50, 60 years, but that tree might continue for hundreds of years, and it's an ongoing charity. We know how serious the issue of animal rights and the environment is to the Creator, where a woman, the hadith says she went to hell because of a cat. She harmed the cat to death, and so she tortured the cat, and he died, and because of that, she was cursed. And similarly, the prostitute who lived a very bad life, she came on a very hot day and she found this dog dying of thirst. And so she put her shoe in the well and said, I'm feeling thirsty. Surely this creature is also feeling thirsty. And she fed the dog and she was forgiven. And then she was, granted paradise through that. And so the choices you make, from what you buy in the shop, how you use your car, leaving your lights on unnecessarily, you must understand that there is reward and there is consequences for the way we live our life. And it is a spiritual consequence, not just an economic one. And so as a faith-based community, it is very important for us to think of the environment and the animals and the creatures that we live in as part and parcel of our iman and our responsibility as Muslims. Jazakallah khair. Thank you again for your time. And thank you again to the panelists. Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi.
Shukran, Mohamed. Thank you for the contribution. In fact, in secular circles and secular science, there's a theory that's emerged called the Gaia theory, or the theory of Mother Earth, that almost postulates that the Earth should be thought of as a living being itself, as a living organism, and that anything that we do, dig into the ground, or overconsume or pollute the Earth, you're actually affecting this living organism. And it's not actually that secular. I mean, based on what Mohamed has just said, we should essentially be respecting the Earth as an organism. We should be respecting it as one of God's creations, in the same way that we are meant to respect our fellow human beings. So next, we'll have Nabil, and of course, based on his extensive research on especially sustainable development and Islam, and I think Nabil is quite impressed me quite a bit on the more sort of forward-thinking ideas and solutions. Let me pass on for Nabil's perspectives.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Firstly, thank you to Al-Ikhlas Academia Library for making this webinar happen on global sustainability. Right now, we are in a crisis, a global crisis, an environmental crisis, a humanitarian crisis. And unfortunately, we are not giving due emphasis to this crisis. In actual fact, I think we should recognize it as a state of emergency. I think it's more of an emergency than the current pandemic. As bad as the pandemic is, we find that the current crisis that we are experiencing now, it's a state of emergency. And unfortunately, since 1987, right up until now, 2020, 32 years, there hasn't been much progress in the way of sustainable development, right? So the discussion of sustainable development has been continuing for 32 years. And as Malcolm has shown, that Right now, we find that the amount of CO2 in our atmosphere is over 400 ppm, right? Nowhere before the 20th century was it above 300 ppm. And they say that if we continue at the current rate of consumption, by mid-century, we will find that the carrying capacity of the earth won't be able to hold our current consumption. So something that I really want to evaluate is this term sustainable development, or this buzzword sustainable development. If we think of development in the sort of neoliberal or the capitalist sense, then I actually see the term sustainable development as an oxymoron. Because if I were to ask you the question, is it progress, right? If the cannibal eats with a fork, right? Of course, it's not progress. Progress if the cannibal eats with a fork, because unfortunately, the sustainable development discourse, it's laden with a neoliberal bias, meaning it's focused solely on development, progress, and maximization of profit. Now, this isn't a problematic per se in itself, but when this becomes an end in itself, it becomes a problem, right? So when we're focusing solely on the maximization of profit, then it begins to undermine the preservation of the environment and social justice or social equity. So one of the core problems that we have with the UN and the Sustainable Development Goals is that they haven't taken into consideration the degenerate role that capitalism has played in sustainable development, right? And so what I want to call towards is systemic change, that we need to change the economic system itself. That is where the root problem is. And we cannot come up with solutions for the current problem if we're still thinking in the same way that brought around those problems. And so that's the first problem I wanted to mention, the economic problem itself. And secondly, there's the problem of overconsumption and consumerism. Now, consumerism is the vehicle for capitalism. And right now we are living in a world of hyperconsumption, where because of globalization, we have removed all consumer restraints. So it's more consumption by greed as opposed to consumption by need. And our wants have now become needs. And so what I wish to open up later on in the discussion is the importance of voluntary simplicity and the importance of ethical consumption. And so I really find the two core problems. Thanks firstly to Malcolm and Dr. Gaathir for really giving an excellent introduction into the problem and why we need sustainability. But what I also want to touch on here is the problem as to why the sustainable discourse hasn't worked over the last 32 years. And I think at the core of the problem is the economic system that we are working with and that of consumerism and overconsumption. Shukran.
Oh. Shukran, thank you, Nabil. And I think that's a good point for us to move into the discussion. And especially the topic of overconsumption and mass consumerism, globalization. I think those are lots of the questions, and sometimes uncomfortable questions, that we need to ask ourselves. To really start to think about solutions. So we have a question, in fact, from one of the audience members, one of the listeners, on local communities, and it's positive. It's a positive thing to see that local communities are actually looking for solutions. They're asking those questions. What can we do in our daily lives? So maybe I'll start. Go back around to Malcolm. For perhaps some initial thoughts on, what everyday people, what people can really start doing in their daily lives.
Thank you, Nasir. I think it's fair to say that I'm no expert in, I'm no social scientist, so I'm going to express these as personal opinions rather than anything else. And I think Nabil's touched on something that is critically important, which is this idea of an element of voluntary simplicity. I think this idea that the current economic system is so dependent on consumption that in actual fact, the COVID environment has actually really laid bare the vulnerability of our current economic system. Because the minute we had to stop in order to survive as a species due to the virus, our economic system became incredibly unstable. And as a result of that, we're now dealing with the quite severe consequences of even just a short-term stop in the economic system. And so I think we're at a quite a critical transition point in, I guess, quite a significant transition point that we're about to be faced with. Because if a virus or pandemic, which can affect a community like South Africa, or just let's localize it, let's just look at Cape Town and how dependent Cape Town is on certain types of economic activities, then what would a significant shift in the climate system or the overall kind of planetary system do to us if we had to have some sort of significantly severe event? And so I think that we are forced to think about it at a community level. And I guess it almost goes from like the significance of like at a planetary scale right down to the individual, where we each almost individually have to start asking ourselves, like, what do we need to do to simplify our lives, reduce our individual impact? Because it's no good trying to point fingers at other people. Like, we have to change our own ways of living, actually. We have to change our own consumption patterns. Do you need to get in your car? Could you walk where you need to go to? Is it possible to do it on a bicycle? I guess a simple thing like working from home. And these are just at one level. Do I need to buy as much stuff in terms of clothing as I always have? You know, do I need to live in a world where I have to always buy new clothes? And so there's quite a significant change, I think, that's going to need to be brought to us as a species, but us individually. And you know, I'm far from pointing fingers. I mean, I myself have to change my lifestyle. And so I think that it's about what each of us as individuals really need to think about. And that collectively can have a big change. But if we start trying to look too far out there, and I agree that there is a conversation we should have about community and government, but let's start at the individual and then work from there.
Thank you, Malcolm. Nabil, if I can go on to you for some of your perspectives and suggestions.
Yes, so with regards to solutions, I think before we can think about concrete solutions, we have to think of our conceptualization of sustainable development, sustainability. And Sheikh Mohamed, he gave a really brilliant introduction as to the conceptual elements that Islam has to offer to sustainable development, to sustainability. Something that I wish to propose, right? And scholars like Sheikh Al-Qaradawi has mentioned this as well, the importance of including in our maqasid al-sharia the maqasid of hifdhul biya, the idea of preservation of the environment. So within Islamic law, we have the maqasid al-sharia, which is the higher objectives or intents or purposes of the divine law. We have that as the preservation of religion, the preservation of life, the preservation of the intellect, of progeny, property, and dignity. All right, in that particular order. So what I'm calling towards is that we need to begin to include hifdhul biya, the preservation of the environment, in our maqasid al-sharia. And thus we may also draw on our rich tradition of ecological fiqh. Right? Islam, I think, has many conceptual ingredients by which we can carve out a vision of sustainability, the idea of us being khalifas, the idea of us being stewards or custodians on this earth. So it's not just preservation for preservation's sake. It's not just about self-preservation, right, as we find in the dominant sustainability discourse, but it's the idea of us having an amana, the idea of us having a responsibility to look after our planet and the beings that is in our planet. So it's a divine command, essentially. And then we also have this idea of mizan, the idea of a cosmic balance, that we need to maintain this cosmic balance and not upset this cosmic balance. And Allah says in the Quran, in Surah Al-Rahman, He says, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانَ, that He has raised the heavens and He has placed a balance, or a cosmic balance. أَلَا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ, so do not transgress this balance, or do not upset this balance. وَأَقِيمُوا الْوَزْنَ بِالْقِسْطِ وَلَا تُخْسِرُوا الْمِيزَانَ. And he has established this balance with justice. So do not fall short or be deficient in this balance. And so this balance is something that we need to consider. And Islam is a faith of moderation. We have this concept of wasatiyah. Allah says, وَجَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا, that He has made us a middle nation so that we may be witness unto mankind. And I think just touching on our economic system itself, I think we have really sophisticated economic system. On the one hand, it's not capitalism. On the other hand, it's not restrictive socialism. It's somewhere in between. And if we think of the classical instruments of sadaqah, zakah, awqaf, right? Zakah being our obligatory charity, right? It's not just a mere tax, but it's a means by which we can purify our wealth. It's a means by which we can gain closeness to our Creator, right? So it's not just distribution for distribution's sake. And I think this is a really powerful tool, right? It's not just a mere tax, but it's a levy on one's accumulated wealth, right? So imagine 2.5% on your accumulated wealth. So it prevents tight-fistedness as well as hoarding. And so I think this is a revolutionary idea. If we were to just implement that 2.5% levy on the world's wealthiest 10%, I think we will alleviate, not actually alleviate, we will actually get rid of poverty. And so you wouldn't have companies like Amazon getting away with 0% tax for the year, right? But besides our instruments of distributive justice, we also, I think we should focus on increasing the economic pie, right? So there's more to distribute. And the awqaf has been a powerful instrument through Islamic civilization for development, right? We've built mosques, universities, schools, hospitals, and so on. And I think we should reimagine how we can use the awqaf. So the awqaf, for instance, can be used to fund entrepreneurs, businesses. So we can operate as a VC firm, for instance. So I think there's many creative ways by which we can use the awqaf. And something as well that I want to mention is the importance of consumption and reducing our consumption, that idea of voluntary simplicity. So within the Islamic tradition, we have this idea of zuhd, which is asceticism or detaching from our base desires. It's about living a lifestyle of simplicity, living a lifestyle of minimalism or frugality. And so we need to become zahids, right? Where we live a lifestyle of simplicity and embrace voluntary simplicity. And on the other hand, we have the idea of ethical consumption, right? So it's not just a matter of consuming that which is halal, but it's a matter of consuming that which is tayyib, consuming that which is wholesome, but also consuming that which is good for the planet, right? And so we become conscious of the source of our food as well. And our Prophet Muhammad if we look at his lifestyle, for instance, he said, a meal for one is a meal for two, and a meal for two is a meal for four, right? So whenever I go out with my wife or we have a meal, we try to limit our intake, and we try to keep that in mind, that the meal for one is a meal for two. We don't have to be excessive. And a very interesting hadith, we all know the hadith with the Prophet Muhammad he said that we should consume 1/3 food, 1/3 water, and 1/3 air. But often we forget the first part of the hadith. And the first part of the hadith says that there's no worse vessel to fill than the human body. And it is suffice for man just to keep his spine upright, to have a mere morsel of food. And if not, so there's a conditional statement, if not, then 1/3 food, 1/3 water, and 1/3 air, right? And so in the lifestyle of our Prophet Muhammad we see that lifestyle of simplicity, of minimalism, of frugality. There's hadith as well where they asked the Prophet, there was a time where for 2 months there was no smoke coming from his house, and asked him, what did you eat? They said, I just had dates and water, right? And that gives reference to the fact that the Prophet Muhammad he hardly consumed meat. And so we should consider our consumption of meat, right? Every second day in our Muslim community, we eat in akhni or biryani, all right? We should consider, I'm not saying we must become vegetarian, but maybe adopt a lifestyle where we're having meat once a week, right? And maybe a weekday, we are weekday vegetarians, and one day we're having white meat, and one day we're having red meat. So I think we at the core of the solution is the importance of reducing our consumption, consuming that which is tayyib, and living a lifestyle of zuhd.
Shukran, Nabil. I mean, I think this idea of reducing consumption, of moderating what we eat, seems to be a common theme across some of the discussion here. What I'd like to ask from Mohamed West is really, if there are any, and Nabil touched on quite a few of them, but if there are any other examples of both societies in the times of the prophets that have taken on this challenge, that have gone the route of simplicity, as the first point. And I think the second point is the interesting one that Nabil touched on as well, which is really about the use of charity and the use of, let's call it our wealth, and how we can better use our wealth to facilitate some positive change, to contribute positively, not only towards betterment of societies, for the benefit of ourselves, but also for sustainability, for environmental sustainability in particular. So it'd be interesting to know if there are any examples like that in the times of the prophets.
Shukran, Nasir. So yes, so if you look at the framework from an Islamic perspective, and Nabil mentioned a lot of that, in that the guidance is we have to be custodians and use these, use our planet and the resources in a way that is in line with this balance. And it's not so much for the sake of just doing things to preserve ourselves. The hadith says that even if Qiyamah was upon you, the day of judgment is upon you, and you have a sapling to plant, then plant that sapling. Yes, it won't grow because time is over, but it is to do the right thing because it is part of your amana, it is part of your trust. And so we have this concept that everything that is given to you is an amana, it is a trust, and you will be questioned how you've used it and how you've utilized it. And so the Prophet, peace be upon him, his lifestyle was one of, he comes one example. He comes out in a day where he was, he lived a very ascetic lifestyle, but some days it was even more difficult than others, and he was literally starving. And he's walking, he comes out in the middle of the day, and it's hot, and two other companions are with him, Abu Bakr and Umar, and they both feel the same way. Then all three of them are starving. And so they said, you know what, we're all out here looking for something to eat. We know one of the other companions, Abu Ayyub al-Ansari, he's a man that's a bit wealthy. Let's go and see to go and visit him to get something to eat. And so the three of them go, and Abu Ayyub is so happy that he's got this great company and guests, and he says, he wants to give them a feast. And what is his feast? He said, I'm going to make you some bread, I'm going to bring you some dates, and I'm going to slaughter a little goat so we can eat. And the Prophet says, don't slaughter the goat, but okay, Abu Ayyub insists. And so, for us, this is like bread, dates, and some meat. It's like, it's just a Monday lunch for us. And when they're done eating, the Prophet says, we are going to be asked about this meal on the day of Qiyamah. We are going to be asked about this blessing, this specific blessing. It's such a great ni'mah. So it comes down to being conscious of our blessings. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to enjoy the blessings and to use the blessings, but to be conscious about it and not to be excessive and not to waste it. And if you look at throughout the Quran, the heroes of the Quran, the prophets, are people that lived this very simplistic lifestyle, and the pharaohs and the kings, the ones who lived in excess and transgressed, they are the ones that were condemned. And so the balance in Islam is always this balance to live in your life. And in fact, the Quran says, and do not forget your nasib, your portion of the dunya of enjoyment. Enjoy the dunya. And if it's enjoyed responsibly, you will be happy. Allah will give you more. We also have this concept that everything is a blessing, and if you use that blessing correctly, you'll be given more blessings. Allah says there are so many treasures in the land and the sea that you don't know of. Under your feet, above you, there are so many treasures. But if you cannot use, those treasures that you already have responsibly, you're not going to be given more. And so, I know the balance between economics. We want to live our best lives and enjoy ourselves. Do I have to take a cut in everything? Islam shows you that there is a win-win solution. You can do things, if you do it responsibly, you will get more and you will increase. And therefore, coming back to the issue of awqaf, using, from a government perspective, if you will, or from a leadership perspective, to use our resources for the greater good of society. Absolutely, we have many maxims in the Sharia that speaks about, a maslaha, that what is in the benefit of the community. And zakah has charitable endowments. There are numbers of tools and mechanisms which we do for the benefit of all of humanity and all of the community. From the verse that I began with, Allah says that He has given some and favored some more than others as a means and as a test. So those in positions of authority, I speak from maybe perhaps from the ulama fraternity, we have a responsibility more so than the individual to drive these agendas and to be smart in the way we utilize our resources in a way that is sustainable. And so the concept of a waqf, what is a waqf? It's an endowment, something that does not get used up, a sadaqatul jariyah, a charity that is perpetual. So instead of consuming all the trees, you consume the fruits of the trees and let the trees continue in perpetuity. So this concepts are very firmly rooted in the Sharia. And I mean, it's amazing that 1,500 years ago, these things were there. I mean, long before we had things like human rights and animal rights, these tools were there, and it's for us to champion what we have in our tradition, to make our life, to make this planet more sustainable, and to make things for us to survive, and to flatten that curve, as Malcolm mentioned at the beginning, to really to think about the way in which we are living. We cannot continue. And perhaps my last closing remark on this is, it's a big challenge. It's not something that I can fix or you can fix. And so a companion comes to the Prophet, peace be upon him, and he says, what can I do for society? I want to do something, but I'm overwhelmed. And so the Prophet says, peace be upon him, the best of you is the one who sees a problem and he actively engages in it to fix it. So you go out there and you're a champion for good. You make the change yourself. And then he says, well, what if I can't do that? Then he says, then fine, then support those who are doing the work. So whatever problem there is, there are people that are actually doing the work. If you can't be amongst them, then support them. And he says, what if I can't do that either? Then he says, and at the very least, don't make the problem worse. And that will be your contribution. That will be your charity. Don't make the problem worse. So whatever is wrong and bad, make sure I am free. I'm not making the problem worse. And that, inshallah, is your charity and your contribution, inshallah.
Shukran, Mohamed. I think I'd like to switch the conversation and bring Gaathir and perhaps Malcolm in with the experience, particularly looking at the idea of wealth and investments, because what I'm picking up is that, all these stories are quite good. We know that these issues have been around for quite a while, but let's start making this a bit more practical. So what can we do? What tools are available for us as individuals to really start making a real difference? One tool that comes to mind is the impact that our investments can have, for example. And this touches on the same point that Nabil made about directing the proceeds of charity. But if we think of, our pension fund monies, our, cash investments that are really starting to be directed at companies that are in turn contributing to the sustainability problem or helping to solve the problem. So if I can bring Gaathir, and let's start with Gaathir to get some perspectives on whether he believes that investment capital can actually be used to make a difference.
Thanks for that, Nasir. So in recent times, and I mentioned it before, we see that your investment banks, your insurance companies, your major corporates are now taking a strong interest in the environment, to the point that last year Nedbank launched a green bond, right, that listed on the JSE. And Rand Merchant Bank actually issued a 1 billion Rand bond for the city of Cape Town. So we see that there's a big interest in it. And Sheikh Mohamed and Brother Nabil alluded to these tools. And one of them is awqaf. And let's take a practical example from Cape Town, where Awqaf South Africa, the National Foundation, they came into a mosque in Kalksteenfontein and they decided, look, how can we make this mosque green? Now, to backtrack a little bit, the example comes from the Middle East, whereby in Amman in Jordan, the Ministry of Awqaf, what they did was they invested a substantial amount of money into the mosques, whereby they turned the mosques green and they put solar panels on the mosques for energy, and they were capturing rainwater and recycling that and using it for irrigation. So with that principle in mind, the National Awqaf Foundation funded this project at the Kalksteenfontein Mosque as a pilot, and they were using grey water, which is in effect the wudu water being recycled for irrigation of crops. And then those crops were then either used in the community or they were sold to generate income. So these kind of projects, they dot the history books in general. I mean, there's been so much work done by so many research scientists across the entire Middle East and Ottoman Empire, where you see, and it's last month was Women's Month. I just thought I'd mention this, that many of the smaller awqaf or smaller investments that Sheikh Mohamed so beautifully explained, 60% of them were actually donated by women because the wealth was theirs. So your small community garden that grows vegetables, your well that gave water to the community, this fountain, that spring. And one of the largest ones is known as Darb Zubaydah, which was a road built for Hajjaj from Basra to Mecca. And to give you an idea, when the Ottoman Empire came in and they did maintenance on Darb Zubaydah, it took them almost 14 years just to fix it. So there were multiple wells along the way and the road made travel easy. And so these kind of investments dot the history books. But in a modern context, and Malcolm can obviously expand on these kind of things because he's been in the sector, you see there's a big interest in solar, in agriculture, in tech, in so many things that can help improve the environment because people are understanding the value behind it and they're seeing the impact that it has. But they're also understanding that it affects their bottom line at the end of the day. Because our modern generation of young people, if they see your brand is not aligned to their sense of ethics, or they think that you are crossing a line, or they boycott you. So brands and banks and whoever are beginning to understand that the consumers have power, and we must realize that because as a consumer, you get to choose where you and how you spend your money. If you are mindful and you realize that at the end of the day, we can divest or we can have sanctions against this company if they are not ethical, then you're able to do that. And I think these kind of investments, they're going to play a big role, particularly in our community, because studies were done a few years ago on the Muslim community in South Africa by one of the banks, very informally, and they said that our population is in the region of, say, about 5% of the country, but we contribute to 25% of the country's GDP. Now, that is a substantial amount of buying power that you're able to, if you put it in the right places, and you're doing your awqaf, and you're paying your zakah, and you're giving your sadaqah, you can change an economy. And I think it's with that in mind that we need to just be cognizant of how and where we spend our money, Nasir.
Thank you. Thank you, Gaathir. And if I can pass to Malcolm to touch on the topic. And I think, Gaathir was talking about the use of our monies and our decision power essentially to facilitate some kind of change. The choices we make when we're looking at the supermarket shop. Do we choose the, or at least do we know, or are we aware of the impact that products and the production of products and the companies that are making those products, are we aware of what impact they're having on the environment? And maybe it's time that as communities, we really start to ask those tough questions, especially of the companies that we buy things from. I'd like to bring Malcolm back in, but let's think about this from a much bigger scale. We're talking about large capital. Very often, individuals would give their pension fund monies to fund managers or to fund administrators, and these funds are pooled into massive amounts of capital, billions and billions of dollars, and billions of rands that are then invested in companies that support businesses. And what's beginning to emerge in the world is that we are able as individuals to ask our investment managers how they are making sure that we are not supporting, that our monies are not supporting unethical companies. No, not supporting companies that are doing bad things, damaging the environment, contributing to social problems around the world. So I'd like to bring Malcolm in here, who's got some extensive experience in this field.
Thanks, Nasir. Yeah, it's a very interesting topic, and within the, I myself don't come from the kind of like Muslim tradition, but I've had some experience in managing a Sharia fund, and I think that it's a good example to use in terms of understanding that how you direct your investments can actually have quite a material impact. And for the past, well, prior to my current iteration in terms of what I do, but in my previous life as an investment manager, I worked quite hard in terms of establishing the mechanisms and the processes for actually building out what is today called ESG, or environmental social governance funds. It used to be called socially responsible funds. And in that context, tried to build out a methodology and a process, both at the company level in terms of how we would build a fund to invest other people's money, but actually at a much more significant level, at a policy and regulation level, how we could set the regulations up in South Africa to actually encourage the direction of capital towards areas that could have a much more sustained impact on our communities and actually, on our planet. And it's interesting thinking about the way we invest money. So let's just take an example. So in this time in South Africa during COVID, a number that's been bandied around quite a lot has been this 500 billion rand that the South African government needed to deploy to help kind of stabilize things during this period. But a number that's probably not appreciated by many people is that in the past quarter in South Africa, 88 billion rand was directed into the unit trusts in South Africa. So 88 billion rand of savings were deployed into the various unit trusts across South Africa in the last quarter. So just in the last quarter. Now, I like this idea of saying, like, imagine a world where that 88 billion was directed in a much more thoughtful way. So most people will give the money to their manager with no instructions. They'll buy into a fund, a general equity fund or a balanced fund. But that fund's methodology is largely around return, with no instructions from the investor to the company in terms of how they want that money invested. Now, obviously, not every individual can give their investment manager instructions, but we could have an industry that was much more responsive to the needs. And let's think of a context of South Africa today. We have massive needs for infrastructure. And let's take a step back and say, what really is savings? Like, savings is to some extent deferred consumption. We're deferring our consumption with the objective of consuming at some point in the future. Yet we don't tell our investment managers how to invest that money. We simply tell them to maximize the return. I want as much money as possible so that we can immunize ourselves against the cost of future consumption. But what if we were telling our managers to invest in a way that built up a stock of capital so that our costs in the future were much less? If we invested in railway infrastructure and we were able to transport goods in a more efficient way, if we invested in energy infrastructure, we would be investing in the future. If we invested in companies that had much more responsible use cases, for example, maybe invested less in fossil fuels and less in companies that have significant impacts on the environment. If we invested in healthcare and improving generally the nature of our society, maybe in the future we wouldn't need as much money to buy healthcare insurance or to invest in personal security, because we'd have less inequality in society, and hence there'd be less crime and less risk. So there is actually a way of thinking about this, and I think the world today is in a much more receptive space to the idea of directed investments that go into ESG type funds that really are quite mindful of how your capital gets used. Maybe even a portion of your capital goes into impact investments, which are really looking to have impacts on communities and societies and even the environment, which may not be looking for a return in a significant way. Maybe it would be the equivalent of some form of charity or gifting that you actually include in your investment mandate. And so I think we're at a time where certainly the next generation are much more mindful of the way their capital is being invested. And I think the opportunities now exist for us to do that. So I think both from a regulatory perspective, I think from a structural perspective, and I think from an awareness perspective. And that is why I think we are at quite a critical tipping point, and these kind of conversations are really important. So hopefully that also stimulates some of the debate and discussion going forward.
Thank you, Malcolm. Yeah, and I think what Malcolm is pointing out, which is quite important as a key takeaway, is that we now have a tool. One of the tools at our disposal is that we can put pressure that, on some of our investment managers to find out, where are you investing my money? Are these companies contributing to the sustainability problem or not? And I think over time, as more and more people do that type of thing, and we certainly see that in the investments industry today, it actually starts to facilitate positive change. I'd like to switch over to some of the questions from our viewers. We have one from Adila Jusufovic, who is really touching on the topic of overpopulation. It's often an uncomfortable conversation because we are dealing with, are there too many people in the world? Are we having too many children as a human population? Dare I ask, should we be putting caps on the number of kids that we have? So how do we balance the sustainability needs, with the needs of a growing population? And I'd like to open up the floor for anyone to answer.
I mean, just a comment around that, and it is a very sensitive topic. I mean, if we even just think about, even in the way we do education nowadays, when I was younger, we used to talk about population and overpopulation, and the very language now cannot be used in the way we have conversations today. And that's not actually a bad thing. I think there's a need for us engaging in this conversation in a much more responsible way. But what is very clear at the moment is that the correlation between population growth, the correlation between economic growth, and the correlation between the impacts on the environment, and I mean, I could show you a lot of data. It's very highly correlated. Now, it's partly to do with the fact that the way we are growing the economy with increased populations is unsustainable. It's not to say that the number of people is unsustainable, but the way we're growing the economy is unsustainable. And so we've got the capacity to feed, we've got the capacity to host a much bigger population if necessary, but we can't host the population in the way that we've historically had the population live and consume. And that goes back to this conversation that we're actually having, which is that there's a significant need for a change in the way that the economic system provides for people. If we can solve that conundrum, then we can actually truly build sustainability. But if we continue doing what we're doing and assuming that everybody can have the same lifestyle in the same way that we did through the early part of the Industrial Revolution and the last part of the 20th century, then we are certainly not on a sustainable path with the current population growth.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point that Malcolm raises. And just to add on to that, some of the inefficiencies. I mean, if we look in particular in agriculture, let's just take agriculture as an example. There's a lot of studies that are showing that majority of the water use that we are consuming is actually for agricultural purpose in the region of 60 to 70%. Whereas those inefficiencies can be heavily reduced if we are optimizing the use of water and applying the correct technology. So that's where these and Malcolm and our other panelists mentioned some of these things. These nexus points between water, and energy and food, and optimizing these the use of all three in order to get better and more products at the end of the day out of our already limited resources becomes critical. So in terms of overpopulation, yes, it is an issue. Yes, there are problems around it, but it goes around how do we optimize the current resources in order to meet the needs? Because this, Nabil said it perfectly. There's enough to meet everybody's needs, but not everybody's greed. And there's an old North American Indian saying that says, that's very profound. It says, only when the last river has been polluted, the last tree has been chopped down, the last animal has been killed, will we realize we cannot eat money. And that's the thing. This the capitalism that Nabil spoke about and the issues that we have and how we moderate ourselves and manage our resources. Those things are critical in order to serve everybody's needs.
So on the point of So on the point of overpopulation, no doubt overpopulation is a problem with the current consumption levels right now. There's an interesting formula that always used. They say environmental impact, right, is equal to PAT, which is population, that's one variable, affluence is another variable, and technology would be the third variable. But I think the problem is more the problem with affluence and not so much a problem of population. And so if we start looking at the consumption levels of industrial countries and we reduce the consumption levels, and then we wouldn't have to resort to the discussion of overpopulation. If you actually look at the early 20th century, the rate of population growth was about 1.7%. Currently, right now, the rate of population growth is 1%, right? And so there is actually a decrease in population growth. And so we need to reach a point where we are sustainable in the terms of resources that we use itself. And so we need to think of the technological use and our innovation in terms of developing technology and reducing our consumption and affluence. So it's more problem. It's a problem of affluenza. All right. And just to touch on the point that Dr. Gaathir mentioned about our resources and water use, right? If you just look at meat consumption alone, right, they say about 70% of the of greenhouse gases comes from the production of methane, right? Because of cattle farming. All right. And in addition to that, there's a significant consumption of water as well, just because of cattle farming. And so we really need to evaluate, I think, affluence and the consumption of industrial countries. And I don't think we want to begin to have the conversation of introducing policy to reduce procreation, because it may lead to totalitarianism. And we wouldn't want to be living in an Orwellian world. So I think we should we should think about technological innovation and reducing our consumption before we begin to talk about reducing population.
Thank you, Nabil. Thank you. We've got quite a few questions coming through now from some of our listeners. So perhaps we can try and get through some of these questions a bit more quickly. One of them from Hassan Asmal, who I think speaks on behalf of a lot of the small businesses, particularly in South Africa, and he's asking the question, what can small businesses do if they want to start changing business practices, if they want to start adapting to become more sustainable. And this also brings in the debate of the cost of doing better. Lots of people would like to do better, but it's often seen as being more expensive to buy more sustainable. Perhaps let's start with Malcolm again.
Sure. I think it's very hard to give a specific answer, but I think the fact that the question's being asked alone is very important. I think each business has the opportunity to look at the way it's structured and think about its market and how it can respond. And it can be, I guess it can be as simple as like, instead of, and I saw this in India when I was in India a while ago, is instead of plastic bags, I mean, this is a very simple example, but in India, you can't get a plastic bag anymore. You get essentially like a hessian or a hemp type product. So it's more like a plant-based product bag, which has more sustainable characteristics to it. So I guess like like every business needs to think about how they set up. Like, what is your energy pattern? Like, can you have a more efficient energy production pattern? Different types of business. I guess retail business have different types of needs to intellectual capital businesses. Do you need the office space that you've got at the moment? Has COVID provided you an opportunity to think about how you can work from home and be more efficient? Staff don't need to travel as far. I'll give you a small example as to how we did it at Librio, which is the business I have. So we built the business as remote first. So we decided not to have offices, and where we have one small office, we don't provide anybody with a parking bay, but we pay everybody an allowance for transport or to work from home. So we encourage people to actually stay at home rather than commute. And that's had many ancillary benefits. Firstly, people don't have to commute, so they're not stuck in traffic. They're not using petrol, etc. They've actually got more family time now. And so there's all these like weird benefits when you pivot your business just a little bit by looking at how you set up the way that you operate. So again, it's hard to give specific advice, but I think each small business owner has an opportunity to look at the way they run their business and make decisions in small incremental ways that can quite significantly have impact over time.
Thank you, Malcolm. Another question from one of the attendees touches on this emerging issue of plastic pollution, and perhaps Gaathir is this speaks to your field of study and your field of work. It's really a question about how much plastic is actually in the ocean, and is it going to affect future generations? We're starting to read a lot about microplastics. Over generations of human pollution are now feeding into the fish that grow in the ocean, and we are consuming the fish. So inadvertently, we are sort of consuming the plastic of past generations. So can you touch on what you've observed, Gaathir, from a scientific perspective?
There's a substantial amount of research that has been done on microplastics, as you now mentioned, Nasir. And as Malcolm and the other panelists said, what companies are now starting to do is they're starting to reduce their plastic use, just because they're realizing the impact that it has, to the point that Adidas is now, they have a specific shoe where they're just using all the recycled plastic from the ocean. Even Nike, they just launched a sneaker called the Space Hippie that is majority recycled plastic material. So look, there's been a large transition over many years to move away from these single-use plastics. I remember in the late 90s, the former Minister of the Environment, he called the plastic bag the national flower of South Africa, because we reached a pandemic to the point that if you walk down the road, these wire fences were just lined with plastic bags and people were throwing them away. So there has been a huge shift away from the use of plastics. But there's even now, a recent study has shown that there's even traces of microplastics in certain regions in the air. So we are inhaling it as well. And the plastics are so prevalent, and they've caused so many major issues. And they are, as you rightly said, they are being bioaccumulated up the food chain. So really, it becomes a shift, a transition away from those materials that are unsustainable, that we need to really try and understand, how do we move away from those kind of things, and how do we leave the earth in a better place? Because many people thought in the past, and you spoke about the ocean, we could just dump into the ocean and it would self-attenuate. There are systems, like a wetlands, for example, that do act as filters, and the ocean to a certain extent. But there's only so much any system can take until it completely breaks. And like you said, and the topic is, are we really killing the earth? And maybe we're heading towards it, but we need to think how do we help save the planet? And stopping plastics use is a big thing that we need to really challenge and tell corporates that they need to move away from.
Thank you, Gaathir. Another question from the panel really touches on what is known in, I think, academic circles mostly, but also increasingly in corporate circles as the Sustainable Development Goals. And it's something that has, come up as quite a prominent feature in the way companies are starting to organize themselves. Thinking about these really important goals set by the United Nations for countries and for essentially global regions to achieve, and these are goals that address problems related to the environment, they address problems related to society, such as underpaid labor, such as forced labor and migrant labor, and it's really starting to address a lot of the issues by asking companies to think about how their businesses are either contributing or negatively or contributing positively to a lot of the sustainable development goals. So I think the question is then takes that one level lower, because it's saying, a lot of this messaging is pitched at corporates, it's pitched at governments, but how do we make the population, how do we make the masses, how do we make ordinary people a lot more aware of the same issues, and I think in that way it almost facilitates and helps us facilitate changes in our daily lives. One idea I can think of off the cuff, and I'll leave this thought there, is to get the Sustainable Development Goals or something like the Sustainable Development Goals into the schooling system. Perhaps I can open the floor to Mohamed West.
Jazakallah khair, Nasir. So, there was an interesting comment, when the coronavirus, started, and it really caused all of us to change our lifestyle. And it said, what the climate change people need is to hire the same PR firm that the coronavirus hired, because it really shocked everyone into action. And so, people are intelligent, people are good by their nature, they want to do good. And it's just about a question of messaging. I work for, not just besides for the imam side of things, more of the accountant. I work in the, I work for Woolies. So obviously, a company that tries to be sustainable and tries to make the point that we have apart from reporting on our finances, we report on our integrated report and our good business journey. Where we are doing things ethically. And it is. I think the issue is from corporates and from a higher level to make it part of your as a philosophy. We're going to make this change, whether it's the right thing to do, and people will buy into that, and people will look at choosing a more responsible option. It might cost you more, but if you look at how the chickens are treated, option A versus option B, you look at how the cows are treated, just as a human being, you would want to make the right choice. And so it comes down to I speak from as an imam, to get that messaging across. It's a good point you said, getting our kids to understand these developmental goals, to say we need to reach these targets as a society each year. Otherwise, the repercussions are going to be catastrophic. And so the way, look at how we are messaging the coronavirus. Everyone knew what the daily infection rates were. We knew where the curve was because we understood the consequences. And so I think really we need to learn from this pandemic, how to really get the message across to the broader community. And I believe firmly that we will start seeing a more conscious community doing things for the right reasons. And so it's our education system here comes into play. And if it becomes an agenda, I think if the people make it as a priority, it will become a priority for our community.
Thank you, Mohamed. Another question we have, which is quite a simple question from Samira Ahmed, is really asking the question: is it too late? And I guess what I'd like to open the floor to is just to get your perspectives on what makes you optimistic, and it touches on the issue of either we need this to be a rapid change. Change needs to happen today, if we are to save the future. And what most of us are seeing is incremental change, and there's very slow change by governments, very slow change by corporates over long periods of time. So the question is really saying, what makes you optimistic that the type of change that we are seeing at the moment is going to help us in the future? Oh, I'll open up the floor for anyone to comment.
The thing is, you have to, at the end of the day, Nasir, I really think, and this is something that Sheikh Mohamed speaks about and Nabil has spoken about, we have to stay positive as Muslims at the end of the day. And we see, particularly in certain circles, depending on how you look at it, and let's take Cape Town as an example, right? We thought we're going to have day zero, right? People thought there's going to be no more water in the taps, there's going to be issues, problems. The dam levels are more than 80% there, alhamdulillah. Not just that, last week they sunk 4 boreholes that is now also adding to the water supply. So there are more and more solutions that are popping up with the issues people are facing because they're becoming creative about it and they're using the resources available to them. So in the short term, people are concerned, yes, there are problems, but I think in the long term, we just have to stay optimistic and find these solutions and do our best in order to do what each and every person can do on their own, and then cumulatively as communities, and obviously in our country and continent and globally. And inshallah.
Thank you, Khair. So I'll mark you down as an optimist, and if I can ask some of the other panelists.
I think maybe from a Islamic perspective, again, I think the question is it too late? It's an irrelevant question. You do what you can, and you sort of leave your obligation. Our obligation from the Creator was you're the custodian. You do what you need to do, and leave the results in the greater powers. And ultimately, we are an optimistic faith, and we believe that if everyone does the right thing, then automatically things will fix itself, and it's never too late. I mean, the chance for change is never too late. You just no matter how far you've strayed, you one step in the right direction, you can come back. So I think it's about the change needs to happen now, and we are very smart creatures. We can solve any problem if we apply our minds to it. We've seen in this coronavirus, as the positive side of it is how quickly we could adapt and how quickly we can change our ways of living and our habits if we really apply ourselves. And so it is about everyone just being conscious. And I firmly don't believe it is too late. We have to do what we can, and we can overcome the problem if we make those changes at an individual level.
Yeah, I think you can put a tick next to my name as well. I think you can put a tick next to my name as well. You can put me as an optimist as well. I definitely don't think it is too late. I think I'm really optimistic about our community, the South African community and the Muslim community as well. It's a really active community. There's a strong spirit of activism as well. If we should reinterpret this idea of jihad within our context, I would say we should begin to speak about a green activism of some sort. Activism in the sense of creating strong civil society, right? And at the same time, an activism whereby we can initiate positive change and change policy as well. And just reiterating what Gaathir had to mention with regards to this amazing talent as well in our community, especially technologically speaking. I'm a technological optimist. I do think, I'm not pessimistic about technology, but I do think there's a lot of opportunity in that sense as well. I was just now recently speaking to a software designer, and we're talking about blockchain, right? And I was talking to him about the problem of the chocolate industry, particularly in the Ivory Coast, and the problem of the exacerbation of poverty because of the chocolate industry. and the monopoly on resources, deforestation, slave labor as well, child labor that we currently have in Ivory Coast, and 80% of our chocolate comes from Ivory Coast. So we're so disconnected from the source of our food. And we were discussing some of the solutions, and we were discussing the idea that of the supply chain and being able to trace the supply chain. And he was talking about blockchain technology, which we know is connected to cryptocurrency. But basically what blockchain technology is, it's a public ledger. It's a means by which you can affirm transactions. So essentially using this technology of blockchain, you can actually trace the transactions within the supply chain. And I was thinking, wow, that's like really an innovative solution. And it brought some more optimism in me, recognizing that there's a lot of talent. And so essentially, if we were to buy a chocolate tomorrow on our shelves and you were to implement the solution, you could scan that barcode in on your phone and it will pull up the blockchain and will be able to tell you the supply chain. Who was the retailer, from the consumer to the retailer, to the producer, to the farmer. And so this will also increase ethical consumption. And so yeah, there's a lot of innovation in our community. There's much creativity and talent.
I think maybe just to confirm, and maybe I'm firmly in the optimistic camp as well. Although I'm not going to lie, I do have moments where I waver a little bit when we just don't seem to get to realize like the severity of what it is. And I think part of the problem is that we've historically, our language has not been very good. And I think Nabil made the point around sustainable development. I think what we have experienced as Cape Townians through the water crisis, as South Africans through the energy crisis over the last 10 years or so, and now through COVID, is that when we understand the imminent threat, we are very good at responding. The problem with the sustainability challenge or the climate challenge is that we've historically cast it in a way that it's not appreciated in terms of the urgency. And I think the recent move from, let's say, climate change or global warming to using language like the climate emergency, and more recently the suggestion is that if we thought about it as climate cancer, might actually shift the conversation to a high degree of urgency. And it's that urgency that I do sense is now starting to emerge. And hence, I actually do feel a high degree of optimism in the sense that I think the youth and really do appreciate the extent of the emergency. I think that you can see it coming through in many parts, whether it be within the religious movements, whether it be in the secular movements, that there's a strong sense of awareness around that, what the problem is and the challenge that's there. And I think to align with what Nabil was saying, I think a lot of the solutions lie within technology, which will drive high degrees of optimization. And by being more optimal about how we do things, by being more accountable, by being more aware, we essentially move into a space where we can respond. And so, yeah, I'm an optimist. I think that what we require is a much higher degree of urgency, though, around the problem, because ongoing complacency around the climate risks that we now face will mean that the problem becomes more severe and the consequences will be more extreme. And we will still end up dealing with it, but it will be at a much greater cost to society in its whole. So yeah, I'm firmly an optimist, but I do think that we need, as leaders and as members of the community, to start, and this conversation is part of that, like really accelerating and increasing the awareness around the urgency of what we need to do, both at an individual, at a community, and at a collective level.
So 4 out of 4 optimists. It's a fantastic panel. I think this is a good point perhaps to close the conversation. What I will request is that we go around for 30-second comment on what you would like your listeners to take away with. Let's start with Mohamed West.
Look, we're all into this world naked, alone, and we will in the same way. No matter where you are, Bishop's Court, Bishop Lavis, you're going to end the same way. And really, what is required of you is how you spend your time on this planet and have you left something, left in a better state than you've come into it? And everyone, if we have that consciousness, what am I doing in my time that I have here? That is all that is required of you. Every person, sit down with your family, think to yourself, this is a problem that affects me. Can I do better? And if you do that, we will find the solution. So I thank the panelists, and thank you for being for inviting me here. And I hope that this conversation is going to be a stepping stone to greater change in our community. Thank you so much.
Nabil?
Just in 30 seconds to wrap up and just to conclude a few points that I've mentioned, I think there's three core elements that we need to focus on and we need to put our energy in. It's jihad, ijtihad, and zuhd, right? The first one, jihad, which is, I would say, green activism, right? Being instrumental in civil society and creating policy change. And then ijtihad, which is a green innovation in terms of technological change, alternative resources and in alternative technology, creating financial instruments, and finally, and so that's green innovation, that ijtihad, and zuhd, speaking about the importance of a green lifestyle, living a lifestyle of low consumption, voluntary simplicity, and ethical consumption. And I think if we follow these guidelines, we may become shuhada ala nas, we may become examples unto others. And shukran to you, Nasir, shukran to the panelists, as well as to Al-Ikhlas Academia Library.
Gaathir, if I may go to you.
Shukran for that, Nasir. So being the water scientist in the room, I think one of the points we need to drive home is that fundamentally we need to be more efficient with our water, our energy, and our food, and just general resources. Right? But the backbone of that in many cases is the water resource. And just to take it a step further, groundwater resources form a very strong component of freshwater resources globally. And we are now realizing more and more how important these groundwater resources are. And on the Cape Platte's in South Africa, people just took it for granted. They dump and they throw things away, and the stuff would end up in groundwater as contaminants. So what I'm trying to say is, and the previous panelists also spoke about, this mindfulness of what am I doing, and is what I am doing affecting the environment? Two simple questions that we need to be asking ourselves when we purchase at the shop, when we walk down the road, as Malcolm said, when we choose to use the car, the bike, or our feet, whatever the case may be. This mindfulness of how we impact the environment, I think, is fundamental for us in order to reduce our carbon footprint, in order to reduce our consumption of resources. And in the long term, because we are really custodians of this planet for our children. We didn't just inherit it from our parents. So with that said, I'd like to say shukran to all the panelists and for everybody that hosted us this evening, and the listeners out there for your thoughtful questions. And let us hope this is, like Sheikh Mohamed said, a springboard to other events like this, and for us to be questioning, our impact on the environment in the future.
Malcolm, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Nasir. I think in the end, my kind of message would be that the solution begins with you as the individual. And I like the analogy that Gaathir has made in terms of like the nexus of energy, water, and food. So I challenge each of us individually to think of it in that space. See if you can shower less or more short showers. I think Cape Townians got good at that. So keep that up. Flush water with your shower, flush your loos with shower water. Think about your food portions. Really try a meat-free Monday, or maybe I love the idea that Nabil had in terms of like a meat-free week, and only eat meat on the weekends. Each of those decisions you make have a difference. And then walk more. I think you'll be surprised. It's not only good for you, but it's good for the planet. So yeah, over to you. And Nasir, to the panelists and to everyone involved, thank you very much. It's really encouraging to be in these conversations, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be with you tonight. So thank you very much.
So with those closing comments, this brings us to the end of the Al-Ikhlas Academia Library webinar on Global Sustainability Challenge. And as we've heard, there are significant issues, but there is optimism, there is change. It's possible for us to slowly start to make a difference. With more interest on this topic, I really hope to continue the conversation, perhaps in future webinars. The Al Ihlas Academia Library wishes to thank our panelists, the technical teams, Academia Library, the team including Shanaz Ibrahim Giri, on-screen media, and of course the supporters of the webinar. Please stay tuned for a short message from the sponsors.
This is a modern cardiac cath lab. It's probably one of the most modern ones in the city at the moment and offers full cardiac, vascular and electrophysiological facilities. So in this cath lab we can do all cardiac cases. It's also a hybrid lab, so we can do vascular cases, and we've got full facilities to do electrophysiological studies as well. So it's going to be manned by a group of very experienced cardiologists. And in this facility, we will have an electrophysiologist to back us up, who is probably one of the most experienced electrophysiologists in the country.
In my field of interventional cardiology, I'm responsible for placing coronary stents into coronary arteries. The cath lab C-arm is a state-of-the-art biplane machine capable of doing both coronary interventions as well as structural interventions.
It's very up-to-date equipment. It's the Siemens lab, just been installed. We offer everything possible, and we're complemented by a surgical team.
So what we're going to do today, we're going to do a test that is called a diagnostic cardiac electrophysiological study. This involves placement of instruments called catheters. These are soft, flexible, tube-like structures which we insert through the right groin, a vein in the right groin. We insert it all the way up into the heart. And these catheters have sensors on the tip, able to read electricity inside the heart.
Rondebosch, I'm very happy to say, has got the state of the art in terms of equipment and in terms of staff to fulfill those desired functions.
With the opening of the cardiac catheterization lab, it affords us the opportunity to now see a broad base of cardiology patients as well. Everything from people that come in with heart blocks all the way to acute, MIs as well. And now we have the opportunity to also put ourselves onto the same level where we can deliver somewhat of first world medicine now.
Today's case, we treated a lady with fibroids. The other name for this condition is myoma or leiomyoma. And what's really important to understand from a patient's point of view is she's not cut open, she's not operated on, her womb is left intact, her ovaries are not affected.
We've got a huge range of technologies in here which allows us to treat all the full spectrum of heart rhythm disturbances. So we can open blocked arteries, we can repair damaged arteries, both in the heart and in the periphery, such as in the legs. We can fix heart rhythm issues, we can place pacemakers, and there are even more sophisticated devices which are life-saving now called defibrillators. We can place those here too. So we really are in a position to treat all the life-threatening cardiac problems that we face with.
The patients will really love this facility because it's fully equipped and it's modern. This is one of the most modern facilities that we have in the city. So I think from a patient perspective, the cath lab is spacious. The facilities before angiography and after angiography are staffed by very capable, so patients shouldn't have any problems coming to this facility.
I spent quite a bit of time in this theatre complex doing endoscopic procedures, which is what we specifically do in this hybrid theatre here. It's one of the more complex endoscopic procedures we do.
Our cardiac theatre is actually attached to this facility right next door. So that's one of the unique features of this facility.
And I think we've now got a service that we're able to offer and deliver to patients which is of quite a high standard. And I think from that perspective it will be both a service not just to the general community but also to doctors that are referring in as well.